The moment Captain Derek Lawson ordered the quiet woman off his ship in front of the entire bridge crew, he thought he was enforcing protocol. But when the radio crackled to life 3 minutes later and a voice from the fleet carrier asked to speak with Fleet Commander Cross, his certainty shattered in a single breath, because the woman he'd just humiliated was standing right there, and she hadn't said a word to stop him. The USS Sentinel cut through gray Atlantic swells under a sky that promised rain, its steel hull vibrating with the steady rhythm of engines pushing the destroyer through another routine patrol. Inside the bridge, the air smelled of coffee, electronics, and the salt that never quite left the ventilation system. Morning watch had just turned over, and the crew moved through their stations with practiced efficiency, voices low, movements precise. Captain Lawson stood near the navigation console, reviewing overnight reports, his posture as rigid as his standards. He'd commanded the Sentinel for 8 months, and in that time, he'd built a reputation for running the tightest ship in the squadron. No deviations, no exceptions, and absolutely no tolerance for anything that disrupted the chain of command. Which is why, when he turned and saw the unfamiliar woman standing near the chart table, his irritation was immediate. She wore a plain gray jacket over dark pants, no uniform, no rank insignia, no identifying marks of any kind. Her hair was pulled back simply, her posture relaxed but somehow controlled. She held a tablet, studying the navigation displays with an ease that suggested she understood exactly what she was looking at. But she didn't belong there. "Who let you onto my bridge?" Lawson's voice cut through the quiet hum of activity, sharp enough to make several crew members glance up. The woman turned slowly, her expression calm, unreadable. Her eyes met his without hesitation, without the deference he expected from anyone standing in his command space. "I came aboard during the supply transfer this morning," she said evenly. "Cleared through your XO." Lawson's jaw tightened. "My XO didn't mention any civilian observers. I'm not an observer." The response was delivered without edge, without explanation, just a simple statement that somehow made his irritation spike higher. Because she wasn't apologizing, wasn't explaining herself, wasn't showing any awareness that she was currently standing in restricted space, without authorization, he could verify. "Then what are you?" he demanded, stepping closer, using his height deliberately. She held his gaze, steady and unshaken. "Someone who needs to be here." A few crew members shifted uncomfortably. The helmsman kept his eyes locked forward. The communications officer suddenly became very interested in his console. Lawson felt the bridge watching, felt the moment stretching, and made his decision with the certainty that had always served him well. "I don't care what you think you need," he said coldly. "This is a United States warship. You don't belong on this bridge, and you don't belong on this ship. Lieutenant Rains, escort this woman off the Sentinel immediately." The tactical officer, a young lieutenant with barely 2 years of sea duty, stood quickly. "Sir, now, Lieutenant." Rains swallowed, then moved toward the woman, his discomfort visible. "Ma'am, if you'll come with me." The woman didn't resist, didn't argue. She simply closed her tablet and gave a small nod, her composure completely intact, as if being ordered off a naval vessel was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And somehow, that calm made Lawson even more certain he was right. She turned to follow Rains toward the hatch, her movements unhurried, controlled. The bridge crew watched in silence, the tension thick enough to feel. Then the radio crackled. "Sentinel, this is Roosevelt. We're looking for Fleet Commander Cross. Is she aboard?" The voice came from the carrier group flagship, clear and official, cutting through the bridge like a blade. Every head turned. Lawson froze mid-step, his certainty fracturing as the words registered. Fleet Commander. Not visitor. Not civilian. Not observer. He turned slowly back toward the woman, who had stopped at the hatch but hadn't turned around yet. His mind raced, replaying every detail, searching for the rank he'd missed, the insignia that wasn't there, the explanation that should have been obvious. Lieutenant Rains had gone pale, his hand still awkwardly hovering near the woman's elbow as if he'd forgotten how to move. The communications officer looked between his console and the captain, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. And finally, slowly, deliberately, the woman turned back to face Lawson. Her expression hadn't changed. Still calm, still controlled. But now there was something else in her eyes, something that made his chest tighten with the dawning realization of exactly how badly he'd just miscalculated. "You were saying, Captain?" she asked quietly. The silence on the bridge was absolute. Captain Lawson stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was hearing with what he'd just done. Fleet Commander. The woman he'd ordered off his ship carried a rank that put her 2 full levels above him in the chain of command. The radio crackled again, more insistent this time. "Sentinel, do you copy? Requesting confirmation of Fleet Commander Cross's location." The communications officer looked at Lawson, eyes wide, waiting for orders. But Lawson couldn't speak. His throat had closed, his certainty replaced by something far worse. The cold, creeping awareness that he'd just publicly humiliated a superior officer in front of his entire bridge crew. Commander Cross stepped forward, her movements calm and deliberate, closing the distance between them. She reached past him without a word and keyed the bridge radio herself. "Roosevelt, this is Cross. I'm aboard the Sentinel, conducting scheduled fleet readiness assessment. All proceeding as planned." "Copy that, ma'am. Admiral wants a status update at 1,400 hours. "Understood." "Cross out." She released the radio and turned back to Lawson, her expression still unreadable. Around them, the bridge crew had gone completely still, every eye locked on the unfolding scene, even as they pretended to focus on their stations. Lawson's voice came out rougher than he intended. "You didn't identify yourself." "You didn't ask," she replied evenly. "You made assumptions and gave orders. I was curious to see how far you'd take it." His face flushed. "Fleet commanders don't just walk on his ships without." "Without what?" she interrupted quietly. "Without announcing themselves? Without demanding special treatment? Without testing whether a captain runs his ship on protocol or on ego?" The words landed like precision strikes, each one exposing exactly what had just happened. He'd reacted to appearance, to expectation, to the assumption that authority always looked a certain way. And he'd been completely wrong. "Ma'am, He stopped, because there was no adequate response. No explanation that would undo what he'd done. Cross studied him for a long moment, then turned her attention to the bridge crew. Her gaze moved across each station, taking in the pale faces, the tense postures, the barely concealed shock. "As you were," she said, her voice carrying clearly but without harshness. "Return to your duties." The crew responded immediately, gratefully, burying themselves in their consoles as the normal sounds of the bridge slowly resumed. But the tension remained, thick and uncomfortable. Cross walked to the chart table, setting her tablet down with deliberate care. "Captain Lawson, a word in private." It wasn't a request. Lawson followed her into the adjacent briefing room, the hatch closing behind them with a solid click that seemed to seal his fate. Inside the small space, away from the watching crew, the reality of the situation hit even harder. Cross turned to face him, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "How long have you commanded the Sentinel?" 8 months, ma'am. And in those 8 months, how many times have you removed someone from your bridge without verifying their credentials first?" The question cut deep. "Ma'am, in my defense, there is no defense, Captain." Her voice remained calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "You saw someone who didn't fit your expectations, and you acted on assumption instead of verification. That's not command. That's arrogance." Lawson's hands clenched at his sides. Every instinct wanted to argue, to justify, to explain that he'd been protecting his ship, maintaining order, enforcing standards. But the words wouldn't come, because he knew she was right. "Do you know why I didn't identify myself immediately?" Cross asked. He shook his head. "Because the best way to assess a ship's readiness isn't through scheduled inspections or formal reviews. It's through moments like this, when people react without preparation, when they show you who they really are." She stepped closer, her gaze locked on his. "And what you showed me, Captain, is that you lead through control, not trust. Through appearance, not substance. You didn't see a potential threat or a security concern. You saw someone who didn't look like they belonged, and you acted on that bias instantly." The truth of it settled into Lawson's chest like a weight. He thought of every decision he'd made as captain, every time he'd corrected without asking, every moment he'd prioritized his authority over understanding. And he realized, with uncomfortable clarity, how many times he might have been wrong without knowing it. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Cross was silent for a moment, considering. That depends on what you do next. Commander Cross returned to the bridge with Captain Lawson following behind her, his posture different now, straighter but somehow less rigid, the certainty that had defined him replaced by something heavier. The crew noticed immediately, glances exchanged, questions unspoken. Cross moved to the center of the bridge, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. Crew of the Sentinel, I want to be clear about something. What just happened wasn't a test designed to embarrass your captain. It was an assessment of readiness, and it revealed exactly what I needed to see. The bridge went quiet again, every ear focused. Your captain made a mistake, she continued. He acted on assumption without verification. He let appearance dictate his response instead of protocol. And he did it publicly, which made the error worse. Lawson stood to the side, taking the words without flinching, because dodging them now would only make everything worse. But, Cross said, her tone shifting slightly, he also did something else. He made a decision under pressure, maintained order, and prioritized what he believed was the security of his ship. The execution was flawed, but the intent wasn't. She turned to face Lawson directly. Captain, you have a choice now. You can treat this as a humiliation and let it poison your command. Or you can treat it as exactly what it is, a lesson learned in real time, with real consequences that makes you better at leading this crew. Lawson held her gaze, then nodded slowly. Understood, ma'am. Cross stepped back, giving him space, giving him authority again. Then I suggest you address your crew. For a moment, Lawson stood silent, gathering himself. Then he turned to face the men and women watching him, the people he'd commanded for 8 months, and spoke with an honesty that hadn't been there before. What you just witnessed was me failing to meet the standards I demand from all of you, he said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier edge. I made assumptions. I acted without complete information, and I embarrassed myself and this command in the process. He paused, letting the admission settle. But Fleet Commander Cross is right. We can learn from this. I can learn from this. And the lesson is simple. Rank doesn't make you right. Authority doesn't replace judgment. And the moment you stop questioning your own assumptions is the moment you stop being effective. The crew listened, the tension in the bridge easing slightly, replaced by something more solid. Moving forward, Lawson continued. We verified before we act. We ask before we assume. And we remember that the people who challenge our expectations aren't always threats. Sometimes they're exactly what we need to see clearly. Cross gave a small nod of approval, then addressed the bridge herself. The Sentinel is a good ship with a solid crew. But good isn't the standard we're aiming for. The fleet needs vessels that can adapt, that can think, that don't just follow orders, but understand why those orders matter. She picked up her tablet. I'll be aboard for another 6 hours, observing operations, talking with your crew, and completing my assessment. Captain Lawson will retain full command. What I'm looking for now isn't perfection, it's growth. Over the next hours, Cross moved through the ship quietly, asking questions, watching routines, listening more than she spoke. And slowly, the crew began to relax, not because the scrutiny was gone, but because they understood it wasn't about punishment. By the time Cross prepared to depart that afternoon, the atmosphere aboard the Sentinel had shifted. Not dramatically, but measurably. Crew members stood a little differently, spoke a little more openly, carried themselves with a confidence that came from being seen as capable rather than just obedient. On the bridge, Cross faced Lawson one final time. My report will note that the Sentinel demonstrated adaptability under unexpected circumstances. It will also recommend continued development of leadership protocols with emphasis on verification and bias awareness. Lawson nodded. Thank you, ma'am, for the lesson. Don't thank me, she said. Prove you learned it. As she turned to leave, Lawson called after her. Ma'am, one question. Why didn't you correct me immediately? You could have stopped it before it went this far. Cross paused at the hatch, a slight smile touching her expression for the first time. Because the best leaders aren't the ones who never make mistakes, Captain. They're the ones who recognize them, own them, and become better because of them. Then she was gone, departing the Sentinel as quietly as she'd arrived. Lawson stood on the bridge, looking out at the gray Atlantic swells, and for the first time in 8 months, he didn't feel the need to control every variable. Instead, he felt something more valuable, the awareness that command wasn't about being right every time. It was about being willing to learn when you were wrong.